Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm Maryam Namazie and you're watching Bread and Roses TV.
And I'm Fariborz, Pooya. In this week's programme we interview AC Grayling on Brexit and why it is a disaster for Britain.
We'll also be talking about the UK government's investigation into Sharia courts and why these courts have to be dismantled. And we will be remembering Baquer Namazi, who is spending his 80th birthday in a prison in Iran after being given a 10-year prison sentence. The insane fatwa of the week is an Islamist innovation on covering women's Awrat during childbirth.
How could that be?
And the slice of life is of a woman singing in a mosque in Shiraz, Iran. Don't go away. You don't want to miss this program.
I have two questions for you, Mr. Namazie. One is, the first one is just a yes or no. You talk about parallel legal system. Is it right that any decision made by any Sharia council, is it legally binding in this country according to the law of this land? Yes or no?
Well, it doesn't matter if it's legally binding.
I'm just asking for a yes or no
answer. There is no yes or no. Because
there is. It's not legally binding.
It doesn't matter.
Okay. Can I just move on to my next one?
It doesn't matter if it's not legally binding, because for the women, and especially the vulnerable women who go to them...
So it's not a parallel legal system then, is it?
It is, because the law of God is the most... it can be the most frightening thing to disobey the rule of God. And when you go to a court of God and where they say that the rules are divine, and if you don't abide by these rules, you can go to hell, you're committing zina, you're committing apostasy.
Mr. Namazie, according to your blog, which I read earlier,
dangerous and difficult.
According to a blog that I read earlier, this isn't just about Sharia courts. If we were to look at your implementation of the view of the world, we wouldn't have any. The majority of the discrimination would be faced by the 33 million Christians in this country, because you'd have a way with Christianity, you'd have a way with, and this is according to your blog, with any religious institution.
This is not about, no.
But it is, isn't it?
No,
because what you're saying is you're denying everybody's religious human rights.
People have a right to religion or not having a religion. However, it doesn't mean because you're a Christian you need to go to an ecclesiastic court for your divorce. If you're Jewish, you have to go to the Beth Din. If you're Muslim, you have to go to the Sharia court. If you're Hindu, you have to go to some Hindutva court. The point is that we are first and foremost citizens in this country. There are rights that have been fought for over centuries for women. Where they have equal rights, where their testimony is not worth half that of a man's, where men don't have unilateral rights to divorce, where women have to go through a million loopholes to get their basic right, where domestic violence by some of the Sharia judges is considered fine, where the judge will ask the woman, well, did you ask him why he beats you? Is it because you didn't cook dinner, or is it because you're going out with your friends? Where you have a Sharia judge saying that marital rape is not a crime, it's not an act of aggression. Calling it rape is the act of aggression. In this situation, clearly there's a problem. So it's not an attack on the right of religion. Okay. So please don't make it such.
I agree.
You've just watched a clip of my giving oral evidence to the inquiry into Sharia courts in Britain, in the British Parliament. And of course, it is the classic accusation that we saw that was levelled against myself by Naz Shah, which is the fact that just because someone is an ex-Muslim or an atheist, therefore they would persecute other people because they're criticising religion or religion in political power like these courts. And of course, it's absurd, because in fact it is the secularists and the atheists who are being persecuted and discriminated against. But it is the sort of victim mentality that the Islamists have been so good at promoting, and lots of people like Naz Shah have bought into it.
Absolutely, and I think a major part of the establishment in Britain has bought into this narrative. And when you see inquiry, investigation is flooded with this narrative, and to unpick this and to support and help actually the decision makers to recognise it's an uphill struggle. When you face the situation that you'll see that even the establishment is somehow hell-bent on maintaining Sharia law despite all the evidence you give. And this narrative, like Naz Shah, supports that sort of direction of the government. And that's the frustrating element of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's frustrating, and also because I think one of the things that the government doesn't want to see is that these courts are actually the product of an Islamist project to control and manage women. And it's something that, you know, people like ourselves who've come from Iran can see very easily, can see through all the lies and deceptions. And it's something that I think is harder for people to grasp when they don't know this movement as well as we do.
Yeah, and I think that's part of activity that you need to have, is part of sort of exposing the Islamist organization, the Islamist narrative, and it's so crucial because they have turned this into an art of deception. The Islamists trying gradually slithering towards power and maintaining and spreading themselves. It's an art form they've actually perfected, and the the society needs to, in particular British society, which at this juncture, which is going through inquiry and everybody's questioning the role of Sharia courts and Sharia law, needs to actually be conscious of this and be informed that this is a dangerous narrative and needs to be challenged.
And what's interesting is that when we're talking about the deception, I mean, it is really an art form. I mean, they have basically they've basically duped lots of people into seeing Sharia courts as people's right to religion, and also something that's pro-woman. I mean, you have groups like the Muslim Women's Network saying that there'll be an increase in abuse against women if these courts are dismantled. I mean, they are the source of abusing women, and they're being seen now as something that's pro-woman. And they've rewritten rules that are beneficial to men into rules that are somehow pro-women. How does one go about doing that? I mean, it is genius.
Typical Islamist sort of art form of deception, and that's what it is. Sharia courts, while it is misogynist, is anti-woman, is inhuman, it's covered now completely by a lot of deceptions by Islamist organizations, and Sharia law and Sharia court project in Britain is Islamist driven project.
Definitely. And one of the things that Naz Shah was saying is that as lawmakers, they shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as if there's anything positive in these courts. Of course, there are women who use it. There are also women who defend FGM. There are also women who defend women staying back and being facing violent situations. There's always women who will excuse anything and everything. There are many Islamic feminists that do that all the time. But the point is that if something is bad for women, if it is discriminatory, if it enhances and encourages violence against women, then yes, you throw the whole thing out. And you need to do that if you're going to defend people's rights. And moving along now on Sharia law, the other thing they keep saying is, we don't want to hear what's happening in Iran, what happens in Algeria, what happens in Tunisia. This is about Britain. It's not. This is an international movement, and it has its paws on everybody's lives everywhere. And a great example, of course, is what happens in Iran, the huge human rights violations taking place as a result of these Sharia courts. And one of the cases that we'd like to highlight today is that of Baquer Namazi, who has recently celebrated his 80th birthday in prison, Evin prison in Iran, after having been sentenced to 10 years in prison.
And this is a typical case that the Islamic regime of Iran holds hostage dual nationals and use them as bargaining chip with European countries, United States. You've seen after every release of the dual national prisoners, effectively they have to be paid. United States government has paid a lot of money to Islamic regime to release its dual national citizens, and that's what exactly Islamic regime wants to do with
using people as hostages, as
other
pawns.
people as well. But I think it's important for everybody to demand that they are released, they are innocent, and they haven't committed any crime.
And also, I mean, Baquer Namazi is someone who has spent his whole life in the service of people, as representatives for UNICEF in some of the most difficult countries where really the situation was so dire for children. He's been at the forefront of doing it. He is one of the most honest, wonderful men you can find. And of course, the reality is that Iran's prisons are full of wonderful men like Baquer Namazi, like his son Siamak Namazi, who's also been sentenced to 10 years in prison, whilst the government is ruled by criminals.
Earlier in the week, I had the pleasure of interviewing AC Grayling on Brexit and why Brexit is a disaster for Britain. And he refers to a number of issues. One of the key points that I think it was interesting for me is that referendum and this type of referendum is not suitable for questions that are fundamentally changing the constitution of a country. That needs to be debated at different levels in parliament, and different parts of society needs to be debated. But one other thing I think we need to pay a lot more attention to is that recognition of the fact that Brexit type is an assault on the fundamental rights of society. They are continuation of the right-wing assault on we've had since 2007-8 we've had the imposed austerity, and Brexit is a continuation of that.
And it's amazing how they are able to dupe the public. It reminds me of the Sharia courts. This is good for women. It's sort of like, this is really good for the working people. Meanwhile, billionaires and the ruling class, going about their business as usual, are feigning to care about the little people, and again, like portraying it as if it's something positive, whereas in fact, really, the more isolated we become, the more inward looking we become, the more we cut our ties with working people across Europe and the world, the worse off working people will be. Yeah. And also, the European Union has raised a lot of standards, including human rights standards in Britain, and again they're looking to attack those and withdraw all of those as well.
Yeah, I think the other interesting point is that the people who are advocating solidarity and European-wide solidarity need to organise, and I think the organisation on the Remain side, it's very big. It doesn't have a centre of gravity that needs to be formed, and we need to challenge all the narrative of the right wing that is daily. We could see that the media, Murdoch media, Daily Mail, and all these newspapers are pouring into society. That needs to be challenged. A centre of gravity for Remain and solidarity with Europe needs to be formed.
Yeah, but definitely, the point is that there is a lot of disillusionment with parliamentary democracy as well. There's lots of lies taking place there. People are being duped all the time as well. They say one thing, they do something else. So I do think this really is something that we have to rely on ourselves to do. Do you know what I mean? It's not taking sides with any of them, but just defending, a sort of the European borders. I think it's such a positive thing, isn't it?
So precious.
We don't want to go backwards, and I think it is key to defend that. It's a defense of working people, really, and their rights.
Yeah, let's watch this very interesting interview with AC Grayling. AC Grayling, welcome back to Bread and Roses programme.
It's always a great pleasure to be on it.
Thank you. We wanted to discuss Brexit with you. You have worked really hard on the campaign against Brexit, and since the June referendum, you have advocated the madness needs to stop. What's wrong, in your view, of people making decisions and taking the country in a different direction?
Well, there's nothing wrong with people being involved in the democratic process, but the democratic process is not well served by referendums, where a very, very complex issue with major constitutional implications is being decided on a very, very simple question, a yes-no answer, in-out answer, and which also was so badly framed, the referendum question and the referendum itself, that it was announced to be advisory, not binding on the government. It therefore didn't specify a supermajority, which is what you need if you're going to have a major constitutionally changing referendum. And even though the turnout was quite high, 72%, the result actually only represents about 37% of the total electorate of the country and only about 26% of the population. So on these grounds, there is no mandate for taking the UK out of the EU, which is a huge decision, very, very, very consequential. And this is not something for a referendum. There shouldn't have been a referendum. We have a representative democracy where we send people to Parliament to get informed, to look at the facts, to think about things, to make decisions. If they don't do a good job, we can get rid of them at the next election, but we send them there as our representatives, not as our messenger boys and girls, but to go and do a job for us. And the great majority of people in Parliament, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, recognise that membership of the EU is in the UK's interests. It should have been a parliamentary decision only.
Okay, but what's your objection to Brexit as such? As leaving European Union, what's your core objection to actually the question put to people?
Well, if we had enough time, if we were going to have breakfast together tomorrow, I could really get into the detail. But let me just pick out a couple of major points. One is that the whole trend of history at the moment is to greater cooperation, to joining together so that the major economic and security problems of our world can be better addressed. We have the United States of America, we have China now. This is going to be the Chinese century, very powerful and very influential. And the European nations really therefore need to be working together. And as a bloc, of course, they have a very great deal of economic heft, and they also have a lot of soft power and influence in the world. This is a very good thing. So as one of the larger economies in the EU, the UK can continue to exert influence and have a major role to play in world affairs. As a little single offshore island by itself, it's going to have much, much less influence. I mean, at the moment, the UK sits on the Security Council at the UN. It's part of the G7. As the country diminishes and the economy grows smaller, as it inevitably will, it will cease to be part of those things. And so as a player on the world stage, it will have much less of a role. Well, maybe that's desirable, maybe that's what some people want. But the consequences for the country itself, especially from the point of view of a diminished economy, means that everything, the health service, security considerations, our educational provision, everything will suffer as a result. It's a smaller, a more minor, very, very much retrenched kind of position that the UK will have, and the opportunities therefore for people in the UK to have a role in wider affairs is accordingly diminished.
Yes, but part of the argument for Brexit has been the grievances that people have. Arguments that the people of Britain have lost the sovereignty. They have decisions are made by unelected bureaucrats at far away, places like Brussels, and there's no accountability. And that's been one of the driving force of the Brexit campaign. What do you say to that?
Well, all those slogans about getting back control, regaining sovereignty, having faceless, unelected bureaucrats in Brussels running the country are all a very, very great deal of nonsense. Firstly, if people were more active and more interested in what's happening in Europe, they would take much, much more of a role in electing our MEPs, in keeping abreast of the news about what Europe is doing, understanding the nature of the European institutions, because Europe is not an undemocratic order at all. The very low turnouts that there are in European parliamentary elections this country shows a function of ignorance and indifference to what's going on in Europe. You can't blame Europe for allegedly being undemocratic if we don't take a full part in it. the idea of sovereignty is a lot of hot air, really. In a world in which we have to be connected, the World Trade Organization, NATO, all our bilateral arrangements with other countries, diplomacy, membership of international organizations, no country, not even the United States of America, not even the People's Republic of China, are sovereign. We are constrained by all these relationships in the world. So instead of fighting against them, we should be making best use of them. We should be seeing that there are huge advantages to giving up some of our so-called sovereignty in order to be in partnerships that are of real use to us.
And the recognition that the people who've campaigned for Brexit, the politicians who've led that, they have argued that they are the voice of the little people. People who have grievances. There might be element of truth in that. There are grievances that people have, and had us the Leave Remain campaign, people who advocate cooperation and solidarity across Europe, deal with those grievances, so to stop the Brexit has taken advantage of those grievances.
Well, of course, there are always grievances because there are always problems, both nationally and internationally. And in the case of the grievances felt by some people who voted for leave, we think about two kinds. There were anxieties about immigration, levels of immigration, and there were also feelings of resentment and hostility arising from the fact that inequality in our society has grown dramatically in recent years, especially since 2008 financial crash, but maybe for a much longer period too. On the left in politics, the populist sentiment tends to be about inequality and injustice in society, and it certainly exists. It's not the fault of Europe. It's the fault of our own internal policies and of the economic situation here and globally. On the right, the kind of populism is aroused by immigration and fears about immigrants and hostility towards immigrants, much inflamed, of course, by our very irresponsible tabloid newspapers that we have in this country. On that front, on the immigration front, people just need to be educated, really, because we need our immigrants. Our immigrants are great contributors to our society. The facts and figures are now out that immigrants in the UK population are actually net contributors to the country's economy, to its creativity, to its wealth base, to its life and flourishing. Look at the National Health Service. People talk about the National Health Service being burdened by immigrants. It's run by immigrants. If you have an accident on the way home today, which I certainly hope you won't, you'll probably be looked after by a wonderfully highly trained doctor from Syria or from somewhere else in the world, or India or something like that. On the first problem about inequality and injustice in society, this is a perennial. It is a real problem, but it is a very bad mistake, in fact, to blame it on the EU. On the contrary, EU labour laws and protections for people in employment are much greater and much better than they would be if we were outside the EU and we had the kind of capitalism that people run in the United States of America, where protection for workers and employee rights and so on are very, very much less than they are here. So this is a systematic error. This is the result of a propaganda against the EU, which completely misses the point about the great deal of social progress that's made in the EU, and the way that EU attitudes towards the economy and to workers and to the rights that people have are so misunderstood in the UK.
As we speak, the Supreme Court is considering government appeal on the right of Parliament to decide on Brexit and the articles and details of those. Can we just leave it to the Parliament, or what do people need to do? People who actually want to recognise there are problems and recognise that they need to stop Brexit and they object to the whole process. What do they need to do? Can we just leave it to Parliament?
We should be leaving it to Parliament, but we should also be watchful about Parliament. I mean, I think the one thing that has happened with representative democracy is that people have become lazy and inattentive about how it operates. This is how you can get such a tsunami of ignorance about what MPs are, what they should do, what their responsibilities are. Because if you think about it, if you had daily referendums, it's Supposing you had a proposition put up on your television screen every morning about a different matter, and people had to vote with their television buttons. Well, one result would be there would be people, dead bodies, corpses hanging from lampposts, okay, because, unreflective attitudes in society can sometimes be very, very sharp, very brutal. But in a very short time, hardly anybody would be taking part in these referendums because they'd be bored by them, and you get 2 or 3% of the country voting on everything. This is why we have representative democracy, because it acts as a kind of filter against emotional first impression type responses which have not been very well thought through or which are not informed. I mean, look, most of us have got our jobs to look after, our families, our social lives. We don't want to spend every day thinking about policy matters and legislation and what we're going to do about the economy. We send people to Parliament to do this job for us. If they do a good job, we might re-elect them. If they don't do a good job, then we call them back. That's the ultimate control that the electorate has over the government of the day. We've allowed ourselves to be seduced by the very poor electoral system we have in the United Kingdom, which is that it's first past the post. This means that most of the MPs sitting in Parliament today were only elected on about 35% of the electorate in their constituencies. And so they've come to think that that's enough for democracy. Of course it isn't. If we had a much better system of general election voting procedures, then we would be much more conscious of the fact that it takes a genuine, a substantial vote to give anybody a mandate. But we've become used to that in general election terms, and now we see it applied in the case of a referendum, which is a very, very different thing from a general election, much more significant, much more consequential, and a third of the electorate have voted a certain way, and the government are acting as if it was a massive majority of 60 or 70% with an absolute binding mandate on them that they've got to go ahead and do this. And that's not the case. Everybody who has any kind of interest in or knowledge of the European Union, and that includes the majority of our MPs, knows that the Brexit decision is a disaster for the country, and that is why Parliament should be taking a grip and stopping it. Ask me, I need to say one more little thing, if I may. This whole debate about Europe overlooks the fact that the idea of European culture, of the peace, of the progress, of the working together, the cooperation in Europe, the building of something which is incredibly valuable, based on all these rich traditions that we share across Europe. This is something that we should be getting people to understand and to realize and to embrace. This is a wonderful part of the world. It has wonderful traditions in it, and we've overcome the terrible historical deficit of too many wars in Europe. The great success of peace in Europe is a really striking fact. And I love the idea of being part of something, of belonging to something which has in it Goethe and Beethoven and René Descartes and Immanuel Kant and George Eliot and Dickens and Shakespeare. They're all part of the same great story, and that is the story that we should all be supporting.
Anthony Grayling, pleasure as usual. Thank you very much for coming back to Bread and Roses.
The insane fatwa this week is from Malaysia. It's something called MamaPride, and it won a gold medal at the, wait, because you didn't know this existed, the International Exposition on Sharia compliant ideas, invention, innovation and design. 2016.
This is one of the machinery you are constantly producing
Bullshit.
fatwas of various kinds, and he's one of those. So what is it that actually produced?
Well, it's wonderful because you're going to give birth to a child, and of course forget about the pain and the anxiety over making sure, you know, it's all going to go well and your child's going to come out healthy. That's really secondary. What's most
that doesn't
important?
Exist. That's not important.
That's not even important. It's making sure your Awrat is kept safe and you're safeguarded, your genitalia and, you know, your womanhood. And
even while you're giving birth,
even
that
while
needs
you're
to
giving
be
birth.
covered.
The Islamists have it covered, don't they?
How could that be?
So you've got to see photos of this, though, because you're not going to believe this. And of course, it's won a prize,
there's
so
a little
it's
hatch.
the best.
There's a hatch.
There's a little hatch. You just undo the hatch.
The baby comes out and then you close the hatch
Close
again.
the hatch again, yeah. It's perfect. MamaPride. Of course, lots of people have said, there were groups in Malaysia saying that the manufacturer was cashing in on politicized Islam in Malaysia, and you've got women's Afghan groups saying it is ridiculous. But of course, the manufacturers have said the response is encouraging. Really? By who? By Taliban?
Islamists.
Did the Taliban encourage you? Because no one we know is encouraging you. No. The slice of life this week is of a woman singing in a mosque in Shiraz, Iran.
And this is interesting because woman's voice is haram in Islam and is not to be heard. And actually, when there are concerts and it's mixed concert, the Hezbollah and the Islamists will close down the concert and disrupt the performance.
Because women's voice is too enticing and it causes adultery, and therefore they'll have to go ahead and stone people to death, so they stop women from singing.
So listen watch this program. But before we go, this brings us to the end of our program. Until next week, from me and Maryam Namazie.
See you later.
Goodbye.
Bye.
بسازم خنجری نیشش ز پویا زنم بر دیده تا دل گردد آزاد یار دل دار دل
Hi, I'm Maryam Namazie.
And I'm Fariborz Pooya.
We're hosting a program called Bread and Roses. It's a weekly program that's broadcast in Persian and English in the Middle East and North Africa, primarily Iran as well. And it's also shown on YouTube internationally.
And we've been doing this since last May. We're coming up to our year's anniversary, and we've had quite a lot of fun making these videos.
We discuss taboo-breaking, free-thinking ideas. The Islamic regime of Iran has called us immoral and corrupt.
And that's why you need to support us. We are the alternative voice in Middle East and North Africa.
Of corruption and immorality. So do support us. Here's a short video from Patreon that explains how you can help us with even just $1 a week. That's nothing. Support us.
Patreon lets fans become patrons of their favorite artists and content creators. It's different than Kickstarter because it's not about one big project that requires lots of funding. It's more for bloggers or YouTubers or webcomics, anyone who creates on a regular basis. Here's how it works. When you become a patron, you're agreeing to give an artist a tip of an amount you set every time they release a piece of content, whether it's a new song, a video, or a recipe. You can set a monthly maximum to make sure that you're always within your budget. Choose an amount, enter your payment information, and you're done. Becoming a patron allows you to view and post in the artist's stream, and in exchange for your support, artists offer additional patron packages, which might include monthly Google Hangouts, music production tutorials, pre-sale concert tickets, or anything they can offer as a way to say thanks. Patreon, empowering a new generation of content creators.